or I guess that was 2 weeks ago he spoke. So that's the thing. I usually get up and say, I'm not a trained pastor. I just look at this using my literary tools. Today I'm saying, I'm not a trained pastor. I didn't learn the pastor jokes. But welcome. I'm grateful for this opportunity, guys, to share with you from the life of Jesus this morning. But before I begin to teach, I want to let you know that I listened last week to the really honest and raw conversation that we had in response to the Isaiah passage led by Thomas. I heard the pain and worry and even doubting the goodness of God in response to the world around us. I had already chosen my lectionary passage for today that I wanted to teach from, and I had begun writing my sermon, most of it written, in fact, but your words stuck with me as I went home and finished my sermon this week and prayed over what I was going to say. I didn't change it, don't worry. I'm not in the point where I feel comfortable ad-libbing. But the passage I'm going to teach from today does not directly deal with questions of God's goodness when it comes to senseless pain and suffering surrounding us. However, I hope that the approach I'm going to take to the text today will provide you with some hope and encouragement. So now that Advent and the Christmas season have ended, we are in the season of Epiphany, between Christmas and Lent. Today is the second Sunday after Epiphany. I don't know about you, but I tend in this season between when we celebrate the birth of Christ and all of the prophecies that foretold his coming, and leading into Lent and Easter when we celebrate the salvation that we have through his sacrifice, death, and resurrection. I tend to focus my reading and my thoughts on the life and ministry of Jesus. So I chose for the lectionary passages today to teach the gospel reading. So we're going to spend some time this morning looking at one event from Jesus' life and ministry, and we learn about it from the Apostle John. I'm going to borrow and slightly do my take on a method of looking at the scripture passages that Valerie Hamilton shared with us last year. And so as we examine this passage this morning, I want to look at it from the perspective of each of the characters present in this passage and kind of what their role is and maybe a few lessons we can learn from them. So we'll look at their role and their reaction to what Jesus does. So please pray with me, and then we'll read our passage together. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to meet together this morning with our brothers and sisters and encourage each other to love and good works. I pray that the message I share would be one of encouragement that builds them up in their relationship with you and grows them in their desire to know you and your love more deeply. Amen. So join me as we read the word of God together. The passage is John 2, 1 through 11. After I finish reading the passage, I will offer a little bit of background information before we start to look at the passage from the kind of perspective of each of the characters. So on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The word of the Lord. Thank you. I want to begin by giving a little bit of background information about this passage and the event it depicts. First, this event, the wedding at Cana, is only written about in the Gospel of John. John does not explicitly put himself in this narrative. However, it is safe to assume from the statements at the beginning about Jesus and his disciples being there, and at the end, that John, as well as the other disciples, witnessed this event and were some of the guests at the wedding. So this story is unique because the other gospel writers chose not to include this particular miracle in their recounting of Jesus' life and ministry. Let's take a look at some context for the story as well. Just before this story, in chapter 1, John describes kind of the end of chapter 1. John describes Jesus' baptism and then Jesus calling his disciples. So while the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist is certainly miraculous, Jesus is not actually performing this miracle. He is kind of more a participant in it. And he calls his disciples. Again, they're following him, but they are following him more as a teacher than as like a miracle worker at this point. And then after the wedding at Cana, moving into the rest of chapter 2, Jesus, his disciples, and his mother, this is in verse 12, which kind of like ends this, but is not included in the lectionary. For some reason, they go to Capernaum, where they stay for a few days. The next two events after that describe Jesus interacting primarily with religious leaders. So he moves from being like a guest at a wedding, moving about his life kind of normally, to going and entering more directly into his ministry by confronting the money changers at the temple, and then in his conversation with Nicodemus. Those are kind of the next two things John gives us and tells us about. So in this story, Jesus is more socializing, not focused on ministry. So let's move on to look at the characters in the story. The first person mentioned in this passage as present at the wedding is Mary, the mother of Jesus. I want to briefly mention that Joseph is not mentioned as present at this wedding and is actually not mentioned again as kind of throughout the Gospels later in Jesus' life. So while Mary is with Jesus throughout his earthly ministry, I base this on some other scholars I read as well, think that it's safe to assume that Joseph is no longer alive by the time that Jesus begins his ministry as an adult. So since Mary and Jesus are invited guests at the wedding, we can imagine that this is probably the wedding of some family, friends, or community members that they have, known for a long time. You can probably imagine being at a wedding with your parents that are longtime family friends. You've been there. So what does Mary do in this story? Anybody? She notices there's no wine. So she notices the hosts have run out of wine to serve. And although we don't know that Jesus, because John hasn't told us, the other disciples haven't told us, that Jesus was capable, that she knows Jesus is capable of performing miracles, she trusts that he could do something about this because she comes to him with the problem and seems confident that he can resolve it. The author and scholar Amy Peeler argues that Mary's role in Jesus' first public miracle demonstrates her prophetic gift. That although Jesus appears to tell Mary no when she asks him to solve the problem, she does not take his no for an answer because she has some belief that this is something he's meant to do. She has some prophetic gift that this is something he's meant to do. But rather than take his no for an answer, she lets the servants know, do whatever he says, obey him. And as an aside, I just want to mention that Mary appears to be a guest at this wedding from what John tells us, who doesn't have a role in planning the wedding or executing it, but she's still taking some responsibility for resolving this problem, which is the lack of wine. And I think that's very interesting, her inserting herself into this particular role. So let's move on to Jesus. Jesus is the person who's mentioned next in the narrative because Mary comes to him. He is an invited guest at the wedding, just kind of hanging out with his disciples, getting to know them, they're getting to know him kind of thing. And then his mother comes and asks him to solve the problem. I think Jesus' response to Mary is very interesting because he asks her a good question. Why should he be concerned about solving this problem or rescuing this family who has run out of wine for the guest at their wedding? As I was writing this sermon, I found myself a little bit perplexed by this interaction between Jesus and Mary. And so I did a little bit of research. I turned to some commentaries. Two scholars I happened to read, Chelsea Harmon and Gilberto Ruiz, both assert that the language that Jesus uses in this conversation with Mary is like very common, colloquial terminology at the time. So Gilberto Ruiz claims the phrase, what it concern is that to you and to me, is a common Semitic or Hebrew expression that implies a sense of disengagement, not active hostility. So while it may seem that he's being a little rude to his mother or even kind of hostile, that she's approaching him with this, it's actually just this isn't my thing. Like, I'm not involved in this. So anyways, Ruiz also points out that Mary doesn't directly ask Jesus to do something about it. She just tells him they've run out of wine. And so she points out the problem and implies that she wants him to do something about it. So I was talking to my kids about this miracle the other day, and it struck me that this is also kind of a unique miracle for Jesus to perform. None of the Gospels mention other instances of Jesus transforming water to wine. We do have the instances in which he reproduces food to feed crowds, which is a little bit along these lines in some ways I'll point to later. But his other miracles primarily involve dramatically improving someone's life or meeting an important need. So feeding a crowd of hungry people, that's a really important need. Healing someone, raising them from the dead, making a blind person see, that dramatically improves their life. Providing some extra wine at a wedding, it's good, but it doesn't quite meet the same kind of level as these other miracles. So we see at first that Jesus appears to be telling Mary that it's not time for him to perform the miracle, begin performing miracles, but he does go on to actually do what she says. She tells the servants what to do, which is to fill the jars with water. And so John gives us some more facts. I like John because he reports facts like, on the third day, this is where they went, this is what they were doing. And then we see in verse 6, we see how much water storage is available. He doesn't tell us where the wine jars are, which I think is interesting, and before I did a little bit more research, I also thought that maybe Jesus chooses to use these water jars because there would be no doubt then that he had transformed water into wine, because there would obviously only be water in these jars. However, Chelsea Harmon gives some interesting information about these water jars. She writes, the very large jars that Jesus uses in the miracle were ones used by attendees to wash and cleanse their hands according to purification practices. In other words, these religious rules and practices that the Jews followed. In using them, Jesus turns a tool for meeting an obligation under purity law into a gift of blessing and celebration. Consider the scale of wine Jesus produces. At the low end, if the jars only have 20 gallons of water turned to wine in them, that's the equivalent of about 600 of our standard bottles today. So it is, she points out, a miracle of great abundance. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this specific miracle means later, but I thought that was interesting to consider, this idea of the jar's typical use being one of obligation, but in this instance, one of blessing. So once the servants fill the jars, Jesus tells them to take some of the water from the jars and take it to the wedding. I'm going to call him the wedding planner. He said something along the lines of Master Sam. I think it's appropriate to call him the wedding planner. And we'll talk a little bit about him later. But now I want to move on to the characters in this story who are observers rather than active participants. We have Jesus' disciples present here. And we learn in verse 2, they come with him to the wedding. At this point, they've decided to follow Jesus and have witnessed his baptism. But he hasn't yet performed any public miracles, so they're seeing him as a teacher. They're disciples who want to learn from his teaching. And throughout this story, the disciples are with Jesus, so I think it's safe to assume they're witnessing these events, which I think helps make sense of the end of the story. So in verse 11, John wraps up the story by noting this is Jesus' first miracle. It reveals his glory, and this is one of the reasons his disciples believed in him and continued to follow him. While John states that this miracle revealed Jesus' glory, we don't see Jesus receiving any public adulation for this miraculous event, at least not in this story. If I were a disciple who had left my occupation to follow Jesus, and I was not sure how we would have enough money to pay for food or lodging, I think I would take a lot of comfort in knowing that he could transform water into wine. This seems like it would come in handy, and I would definitely be interested in finding out what Jesus would do next. I think that's something to think about with the disciples. The other people in this story who observe the miracle, we know are aware of the miracle, is the servants. So they're the lowest of the social hierarchy at this wedding, but they have an important role that is non-speaking. We're introduced to them when Mary turns and directs them to obey Jesus. And although neither Mary nor Jesus are directly in charge of the servants, we understand that they are higher. So now we understand that Mary and Jesus have some authority over them because they do obey them. And they obey Jesus, and then when he asks them to take some of the water to the wedding planner, John points out that they do this, and the wedding planner doesn't know that this is wine that was formerly water. But he adds in parentheses that the servants do know this, which I think is a very interesting thing. So this is the last thing we hear about the servants, is that they know we took water, we put it in these jars, we took water out of these jars, and suddenly it's wine. And so they are aware of this. This is something that they know about. So our last two characters are the wedding planner and the bridegroom. The wedding planner arrives on the scene in verse 8 when Jesus tells the servants to take the water from the jars they've just filled to him. And in verse 9, we get the sense that the wedding planner doesn't know that water has been transformed into wine, or potentially even that they've run out of wine, because otherwise he would just be like, oh, great, more wine. I'm not sure why I'm tasting it. So it's important to me to point out that these are the important people at the wedding. The person who's in charge of planning and executing the wedding, and the bridegroom, the kind of second most important person at the wedding, or maybe in this time, the most important person at the wedding, are not aware of what Mary and Jesus have been doing. They just know that there's great wine suddenly has appeared. They were suddenly serving the best wine. And so I'll admit that it's possible John has left out details. John is not known for always being the most meticulous and detailed of the gospel writers. Usually that's reserved for Luke. But I think we can infer that neither the wedding planner nor the bridegroom are aware of this miracle that has occurred. I think that's significant. And one of the reasons I think that it's really interesting is that it seems like not only were they unaware of the miracle that Jesus performed, but they weren't even aware they'd run out of wine. So they didn't know that they needed to thank Jesus or praise Jesus for doing this event. Rather, we know Mary knows it's happened because she's called it into being. She's called it into happening. We know that the disciples have witnessed it, which has increased their faith and belief in Jesus. And we know the servants know, because they actually kind of helped facilitate it by obeying Jesus. So here's a few things I think we can learn from this story. One, Jesus is convinced to perform his first miracle by his mother. While we don't know that Mary had previously seen Jesus perform any miracles, she has this trust in his ability when she tells the servants to obey him. We also see this as a miracle of abundance and blessing. While running out of wine is potentially very embarrassing, it's not a matter of life and death. However, Jesus shows concern for the bridegroom, for the wedding host, by choosing to bless them with this huge amount of high quality wine. I want to know what they did with all of the leftover wine. Do you have the wedding planner a few days later trying to sell this great wine on the black market? I just want to know. And then again, I think this miracle proves his ability, Jesus' ability and his supernatural gift. But in fact, a lot of people at the wedding wouldn't have even known that it had happened. They weren't aware of it. And then lastly, John reports the disciples and servants witness this miracle, and the disciples believe in Jesus because of it. So I have a few things I think we can take away from this narrative. First, I think there are some characters from this story that we should be like. Mary offers positive examples for us in that she clearly is paying attention to what is going on at the wedding. When she sees a need, she wants to meet it. Although she's not able to meet it herself, she knows that her son can, and she brings her request to him. I think we should imitate Mary by paying attention to the needs of others and trying to meet them, which I think is something we do really well at Ecclesia, is paying attention to the needs of our community and trying to meet those needs. But when we cannot meet the needs or feel that our small part is not adequate to meet the need, we should bring those needs to God. Mary did not know that Jesus would solve the problem, and she certainly didn't know how he would do it, but she trusted that he will and that he does. I want to tell you that the lesson we can learn from this is that we should bring our problems to God, just like Mary did, and God will solve them, even though the solution may not be one we asked for or even want. But I think just about everyone in this room has lived long enough to know that life is not that simple or black and white. Because of the faith that we have in Jesus Christ, I do urge you to follow Mary's example by praying and asking God to solve both our own problems and the problems we witness in the world, while acknowledging that it's not always going to happen. It won't always happen the way that we want it to either. And also, something I was thinking about just during worship this morning is that sometimes they don't happen in the time frame that we expect them to either. And this is actually going to lead me to the other thing I think we can learn from this story. I think we should be like the disciples and the servants rather than the wedding planner and the bridegroom. Although the latter two benefited from the miracle, they don't appear to have been aware of it. The disciples benefited from the miracle as well as guests at the wedding. More importantly, witnessing this miracle increased their faith and their desire to follow Jesus. We also see that the servants obeyed Mary and obeyed Jesus, and then also witnessed this miracle that Jesus performed. I want to encourage you to look for opportunities to witness God at work in your life, in your community, and in the world. I can think of a couple of instances just today that I was talking about over the weekend with people of finances being turned around in my family, that many years ago it all looked hopeless and lost, and God made a way. God made a change. And some close friends of mine just celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary, and when they got married, it was not under great circumstances, and I did not have much hope for that relationship, especially over the coming years, things that they have been through. And to see their relationship where it is now, I'm so grateful. So I want to encourage you, too, that sometimes we're in the midst of things and see destruction and tragedy all around us. Please hold on to hope in seeking God, because sometimes the time frame won't look like what you think it will look like, but that he is perhaps at work in ways that you cannot see. So I wanted to just bring that as an encouragement to you this morning. And one example of God at work that we can witness today is the body and the blood of Christ. This is honestly my favorite part of our weekly gathering because of what it represents. If you see me, I'm usually wrangling a 2-year-old and also trying to prevent her brothers from picking on her. So it's not exactly a peaceful or like reflective time of the service for me at this stage of my life. But it is my favorite part of our weekly gathering. So when we take communion each week, we are reminded that God moved to bring us into right relationship with God through the body and blood of the Son, a much more abundant and miraculous gift and blessing than the water turned into wine. Jesus chose to sacrifice himself for us. So please join me at the table this morning to remember Jesus' sacrifice for us. As we prepare to join in Holy Communion at the Lord's table, I want to invite parents of children in the early childhood class and Kid Connect Junior to pick up your child so they can join us at the communion table. And now I invite you to stand if you are